In Nashville, Tennessee, just 3 hours south of Jeffersonville, stands a full-scale replica of the ancient Parthenon of Athens, Greece. It towers over a sea of grass in Centennial Park, just west of downtown Nashville, as you might expect a temple to the gods to do, dominating everything in its view. Like the ancient structure, its rows of round columns line the 228-foot-long sides of the building and are visible from a long distance. Facing the replica, visitors are awestruck by the 101-foot width of the temple in the style of the ancients, surrounded by modern buildings and technology. Unlike its ancient counterpart, however, the Nashville Parthenon is fully intact and gives visitors a glimpse of what the ancient Parthenon would have looked like before it was nearly destroyed during the siege of Acropolis in 1687. One of our family vacations was a trip to Nashville, and I had an opportunity to visit the Nashville Parthenon. Driving down the long road next to the open field, the massive structure and its surroundings were like a framed painting coming to life. In fact, we stopped multiple times along the way to capture the scene with our cameras. The Nashville Parthenon sits alone in an open field near Vanderbilt University, where families have picnics, children and adults play sports, and stroll along the paths around Lake Watauga. Inside the temple, the building serves as an art museum. A massive statue of the Greek goddess Athena towers over guests as they admire the artwork. Confederate veteran William Crawford Smith designed the Nashville Parthenon, and its construction lasted from 1897 until the opening of the interior in 1931. During his early ministry, the prophet held Pentecostal Revivals with Roy E. Davis. One of their joint campaigns took place on the grounds of the Nashville Parthenon. They must have toured together a lot because the prophet couldn't remember which city had this massive structure. In his sermon, the prophet thought it was at their revival at Memphis, but when he described the location, he described the Nashville Parthenon. Roy Davis's Pentecostal revivals in Memphis were even more interesting, according to the prophet's description of the events that took place. Pentecostals of Kentucky and Tennessee of that era were well known for their snake-handling churches. Ministers in the snake-handling sect of Pentecostalism often quoted the last chapter of the Gospel of Mark. It was one that I knew well. The prophet mentioned it often in his sermons. The passage reads, "They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay the hands on the sick, and they shall recover." It was the foundational text for the prophet's version of divine healing, which should come as no surprise. The divine healing movement within Pentecostalism had many similarities to the snake-handling sect, and likely shared some of the same historical branches, at least from the limited research that I had done to this point. Some who practiced divine healing also handled snakes in the churches. They also drank poison, testing their faith in front of members as a display of God's healing power. I often wondered, why did the prophet focus so much on the snake-handling verses? I also wondered why he and Davis were together drinking poison in their meetings. Hearing the prophet praise Davis for drinking poison made me very uncomfortable. Even during my time in the message, I was aware of the dangers that this type of religion could bring. When I learned that the prophet was a Pentecostal minister when he married his first wife, Hope Brumbach, and that the timeline the prophet described in his life stories was not accurate, I began to wonder about his first years in the ministry as a Pentecostal evangelist. I wondered especially about the year before Hope's death, when the prophet claimed to have rejected Pentecostalism. I was also curious about the message doctrines that we believed had originated with the prophet. From the advertisements for the Pentecostal churches in Jeffersonville that the prophet participated in, there were too many similarities to ignore. How many of the prophet's doctrines were influenced by Pentecostal minister Roy Davis and his brothers? Was the prophet's frequent reference to the snake-handling passage a result of Roy Davis's training? The center of focus for the prophet's alleged rejection of Pentecostalism in his life story accounts was the famous Mishawaka Trip, which happened shortly before the death of his wife, Hope. It was during this leisure trip that the prophet said that he, quote-unquote, accidentally stumbled onto his first experience with Pentecostalism. According to the prophet, he left his wife at home while he took a vacation to Lake Pawpaw in Michigan. I always wondered why he would leave her at home, but with Hope dying of tuberculosis, or so I thought at the time, she would likely have refused had he asked. Lake Pawpaw was a popular resort area in Berrien County, Michigan, just west of Kalamazoo near Lake Michigan. Thousands of people from multiple states come to the resort lake, many of which come just across Lake Michigan from Chicago, Illinois. It was known as Berrien's Playground for Thousands, and the Playground of Chicago, according to the News Palladium. Mishawaka, Indiana sits about 10 miles outside of the large city of South Bend, Indiana, just an hour south of Lake Pawpaw. Both cities are just a few miles south of the University of Notre Dame. Coming up Indiana State Highway 31, the prophet would have directly came through South Bend on his way to and from Lake Pawpaw. At the time the prophet said that he, quote-unquote, stumbled onto the Pentecostals, both South Bend and Mishawaka had grown in population. Like downtown Louisville, Kentucky, or Phoenix, Arizona, the streets were filled with automobiles, towering buildings, and businessmen scurrying up and down the sidewalks to coffee shops, restaurants, and office buildings. I never pictured this when he talked about the Mishawaka Trip. By the way he described his first encounter, it sounded as if he stumbled onto a backwoods revival near a lake in the middle of nowhere. But then, I also never pictured this trip as one to a thickly populated lake resort. The details that the prophet gave about his Pentecostal meeting were helpful in learning more about the revival. He described a large convention with many Pentecostal ministers and many people in the audience. I had always pictured a tent revival, but learning the landscape of Mishawaka and the surrounding area, I realized that the revival would have more likely been in one of the city's convention centers. If so, this would have made news in the local newspapers, or at least within the Pentecostal community. Pentecostalism was in decline, and such a gathering of Pentecostals would have been significant. I found an article describing noteworthy, significant gatherings of Pentecostals, and I began looking for those held in Mishawaka. The two General Assemblies of Pentecostals occurred in the city of Mishawaka. One was September of 1941, much later than the prophet would have visited. By 1941, his wife had already died. The other gathering took place September 17th through 23rd, 1934, shortly after the prophet married Hope. This made me even more confused. 1934 was before Hope contracted tuberculosis, so her illness was not the reason that he did not bring her along. Less than 90 days after his wedding, the prophet went on vacation without his newlywed wife. He described it as a vacation, not as an evangelistic trip or a religious trip of any sort. Why did he need a vacation so soon? I read and reread his life stories again and again. I'd always thought that the trip happened close to the time of Hope's death, and for good reason. When the prophet spoke about his Mishawaka trip, it sounded much different than the historical timeline suggests. He certainly made it sound like it was much later than a few weeks post-wedding. He talked about how hard that he and Hope had scrimped and saved for him to go on the trip, and how little they could afford. How they could not scrape 2 pennies together renting a small 2-room apartment for just $4 a month, furnished with purchases from a junk dealer. How he never took an offering, and she worked at a shirt factory to make ends meet, but somehow saved a few dollars for a trip. It sounded like a cheap fishing trip, not a trip to a lake resort. After learning that he was still holding Pentecostal revivals with Roy Davis at this time, and that he was a Pentecostal evangelist when he stumbled onto the General Assembly of Pentecostals in Mishawaka, I began to wonder, why did he claim to be a Baptist minister at the time? Was this Mishawaka Trip actually an evangelism tour with Roy Davis? Did he leave Hope behind because she was not involved with his already established evangelistic ministry? Whatever the reason, the prophet's life story was much different than the facts I'd collected about the historical timeline were beginning to suggest. I began searching for other revivalists who would have been there with the prophet and Roy Davis. I remembered the prophet talking about the African American preaching and how unusual his sermon was. The more I researched, the more surprised I became at how unusual the Pentecostal revivalists were at the time. The General Assembly of Mishawaka would have featured all sorts of unusual speakers and doctrine. They were meeting to discuss the merging of the different Pentecostal sects into one Pentecostal faith. Suddenly, I remembered the prophet mentioning the merger, and I found that other Pentecostal conferences were held in cities that the prophet often referred to in his sermons. I began to wonder how many of them the prophet attended, and why he claimed that his evangelism started in 1947 instead of 1934. According to the timeline I'd pieced together from the newspapers and government documents, combined with his statements of the meetings with Roy Davis, I was certain that he was fully active in the Pentecostal ministry in the early 1930s. To what end, however, I could not yet determine. I became curious about the merger of the different sects of Pentecostalism. In the message, we heard that God sent the prophet to prepare the way for the second coming of Christ. We were taught that he opened the quote-unquote hidden mysteries of Christianity. The most important hidden mystery that he taught was how to properly baptize converts. Without the prophet, we would have never known to baptize in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Yet the PAJC, or Pentecostal Assemblies of Jesus Christ, was an entire sect of Pentecostals who rejected the Trinitarian baptism. An entire demographic had spread around the globe who already baptized like the prophet. This seemed very confusing. The prophet was a Pentecostal, trained under the Reverend Roy E. Davis. Did that mean that God also sent Davis to prepare the prophet so he could prepare the way? What about the hundreds of other ministers also baptizing in the name of Jesus Christ? Were they messengers of God? The more I researched, the more I questioned the prophet's statements about his past. I continued to find more questions than answers. I knew that one part of his life story was still true. The death of his first wife had a huge impact on his life. He said that it was enough to lead him into Pentecostalism, though I now knew that this was not the case. He and Roy Davis were already holding Pentecostal revivals together, and one of them was at the Nashville Parthenon. I began to wonder, what changed? If he did not experience a conversion to Pentecostalism, what about the prophet had changed? What about his 1930 through 1937 Pentecostal preaching was so different than his 1938 to 1965 Pentecostal preaching? Was he trying to hide the fact that Roy E. Davis introduced him to it? Since he was working so closely with Roy E. Davis, an outspoken leader for the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacy groups, while married to the daughter of Mr. Brumback, who rose to sudden political fame during the Ku Klux Klan's rise to political power in Indiana, who also held the keys to the Ku Klux Klan's headquarters in the Spythe building, I knew that the prophet would have been influenced by the things that he heard. He might have even been influenced by these groups, though I knew I would never find membership records to the clandestine organizations. Which of the doctrines that I grew up believing, that I was trained to believe, came from these men? It was time to look at the most controversial doctrine of the prophet's ministry. I knew that it was controversial for a reason. If it were simply a doctrine found in the Bible, then others who read the Bible would have eventually discovered it. His most controversial doctrine was one that he called Serpent's seed. It was the notion that the original sin in the Garden of Eden was not a result of eating fruit as the Bible narrative describes. According to the prophet, Eve, the mother of all living, had opened her legs to the serpent and had sex. The result of this sexual encounter, according to the prophet, had brought forth two bloodlines, one good and one evil. This doctrine was controversial because of its common usage by notorious leaders and hate groups. Adolf Hitler believed in two bloodlines and attempted to enact genocide against the Jews. The Ku Klux Klan also used it for their hate speech against both Jews and people with black skin. If the prophet was in fact touring with Roy Davis during his early years as a minister and was actively participating in services conducted by Davis and his brothers in Jeffersonville, I had no doubt that this doctrine would have been a topic of discussion many, many times.